So let's start with the EY Center. Very innovative design. It's got natural materials. One thing that piqued my interest was this exhibit of artifacts. Can you tell me a little more about that?
Yeah, I can. You know, one of the things that we're very interested in the design of tall buildings is to overcome, I think, what a lot of people see as some of the negatives. Right? And one of the negatives is that they tend, through their sheer scale, to kind of eradicate often a sense of place and a sense of history. And with the EY Centre, we tried to really avoid that. In fact, we tried to do the opposite. We tried to bring, in a way, the history and the culture and the heritage of the site to the surface more. So, for example, the base of the building is stone, and it's made as if it's been lifted up, and we reveal some of the archaeological artefacts that have been found. And not only do we reveal them, but we actually overlay them with a creative story that's written about a collection of archives. So they're not displayed like some sort of historical chronological display, but more as a way of storytelling about our past and about what happened on this site before.
And these are artifacts that were uncovered during construction?
During excavation, yeah. So we started with archaeological investigation because we sit right at the edge of the old harbour. In fact, the old water line runs right through our site.
In downtown Sydney.
That's right. So then we were interested in uncovering the European settlement period, but also a degree of pre-European settlement evidence that might be there.
And that water line is also reflected in the design of the building, correct?
Yes, it is. In a sense, we've carved that line right through the building and marked it. And then other things that we've done is we've actually made the core of the building out of the very stone that has been quarried from the site.
That's that Sydney sandstone that you see everywhere. It's like a pale yellow.
It's a beautiful golden yellow.
Yeah.
It's called Sydney Yellow Block. And there are no more quarries available because the city's built all over it. But you can actually quarry a site down, and half of that stone's gone to restore heritage buildings and half of it was used in the design of our building.
The heritage buildings being a collection of historic structures around Sydney that have been here since, I guess, colonial days.
Correct, yeah. There was a great turn of the century period where, the post office, big government buildings were made out of Sydney Yellow Block. It's a beautiful stone.
Yeah, but it's not quarried anymore anywhere in the world.
Nowhere. The only place you can get it is really in the city and over in Piermont, where all of the area has been built out. So the only way you can find it now is to quarry it before you build a building.
So was that part of the design from the start, or did you come up with that idea as you were realizing, oh, we're excavating the site, we're going to end up with the stone, what should we do with it?
Well, interesting, it's a combination of all those things, because our concept for this building was that it would kind of grow out of its site, grow almost literally out of the ground. So we were very interested in using the stone that was there, but also the City of Sydney, because they recognise this rarity of the stone, are really encouraging and regulating for quarrying this stone so it can be used in heritage buildings. So these two interests came together.
I think it's a good example of a building a tall building that really goes beyond the stereotype of a skyscraper just being, a stack on a plinth, because where it meets the ground, you've really got a lot going on. Like you said, you're referencing the original shoreline. You've got this historical story you're telling with the materials. How are you engaging the street and the actual life of today?
Well, what we're doing is we're creating a building where part of it is lifted up. There is an arcade that leads through. There are steps that come down to connect it into a emerging laneway network that's going to only become kind of more evident in subsequent developments. So it's very carefully placed in relation to its site, in relation to its topography, and then we've put a great deal of care into the design of the lower levels of the building. Not to make a kind of pompous, grand lobby, but to make a beautiful lobby that is actually connected to its site, its materials, and helps interpret its place. And one of the major elements of that is actually a beautiful artwork by Judy Watson, who's an Aboriginal artist who we worked with very closely, and her work also tells the story of this site, and she consulted with elders during that process. So you have a very kind of deep interpretation of the site. It's not superficial anyway, and we hope it's really going to kind of last.
The laneways that you mentioned, those are these like commercial arcades at the street level along Sydney and in other cities in Australia.
That's right. And what it often is, it's providing small retail tenancies in slightly unexpected areas that can open out and feed pedestrian environments. On the main street, we have a very generous setback, and we have a large awning which extends to shelter pedestrians. And in a sense, we've made that awning as a series of folded timber canopies, which is meant to kind of recall the row of trees that sat at the edge of the harbour front in a kind of abstract way.
It's interesting because every detail about the building that you're describing is kind of part of this story that is tied into the history of the site. Do you think that that is a possibility for any new tall building project, or are there some sites that are more historic than others? I mean, is there always a story to tell if architects dug more deeply, and should they, or is it just particular to certain sites?
I think there's always a story to tell. Sure, some sites are more loaded or more rich than others, but I think there's always a story to tell. And one of the things that I'm interested in the participation of this conference is to try and rethink the tall building and the way it engages with the city from just being a kind of slightly repeated international object into something that really belongs to its place and interprets its place. And I think now is a time when we need to think about our buildings in this way.
Something else that Sydney experiments with at a city scale, I think, is integrating green space and public space to a greater degree throughout a tall building. Is that something that you think about as an architect, and how have you been practicing that?
Yeah, I think that thinking about tall buildings in a more complex, richer way is really important. And thinking about public space as not just occupying the lower levels of the building, but coming up through the building is also really exciting. And I think that's something we're seeing people at the conference starting to explore. I mean, there are difficulties with it. I don't think you can create a substitute for public space at the street by having it in the building, because it is inevitably going to be less accessible, more exclusive, probably subject to security and all these sorts of things. So I think it's a great thing to explore. It's something to add to our kind of public realm, but it's not a substitute for what happens at the street, at the square, and on the lane.
So we've been mostly talking about how the building meets the ground and how it engages with the buildings around it on that level, but how about in the skyline?
Well, it's interesting you should ask, because one of the things that I was really interested in with this building was to try and escape the paradigm of grey glass buildings and grey aluminium. You can't even see who's in them. And what I wanted to do was make a building that you could see into, but that also had a material character which was natural, and in this case, timber. And the way we've done that is through a very complex triple layer of glass and a cavity system where the cavity is closed and air pressurized, which allows us to put timber louvers behind a completely transparent layer of glass. First time in the world it's been done, in fact. And what that means is when you see this building, you look straight through the glass to this layer of timber louvers, like a kind of timber veil. So you see a building actually that appears golden in the sunlight, and then when the sun's off it, it appears very transparent. And this is one of the things I really wanted to try and do, is create buildings that in a sense they're more natural, they're easier for us to relate to and engage with, rather than the kind of enormous grey buildings which tend to dominate our skylines.
Right. And you still have the glass there, but you're looking through it into a warmer material like wood.
Exactly right, because one of the things about high transparency glass is you don't see it, you see what's behind it. So if you put nothing behind it, it'll look black anyway. But by putting the timber veil immediately behind the glass, it's that you see. What this also means is that the light reflected and filtered into the interior has this beautiful golden glow because it's reflecting off the natural timber. So it actually creates a really beautiful atmosphere inside the building.
Not to put you in a box, but does this whole philosophy have a name? I mean, of getting maybe a building that responds, that tells a story, or in terms of how you source the material? What do you call this style?
Well, I think it's a bit more than that. I think it's really thinking about architecture as very connected to its place, no matter what the scale or the type of building. And very often we approach buildings like this when we're designing a cultural building like an art gallery or a museum, which we've also designed. But when it comes to tall buildings, I think you can bring the same philosophy. You need to look deeply at the site. And I have a great interest in natural materials. And I think now's a very exciting time to be interested in natural materials, but because of our materials technology advancement, we can actually use composites and different ways of treating natural materials in very innovative ways and still have them very durable and very lasting.
I want to ask also about the green ratings, because it scored very highly on Green Star and some other sustainability metrics. Was that the goal from the start, to get a certain rating, or did it come about later as a result of using these natural materials and other aspects of the design that you realized, oh, we could actually get a good ranking in this?
Well, it was actually, there was a high level of sustainability was in the brief, but during the process we lifted our target. We made it more ambitious and achieved a much better outcome. And I think the good thing about that was it was very much a team effort, this project. You know, the Mervac, the developers and also the contractor worked very, very closely together, and we lifted our aspirations as the project developed, and what was achieved was certainly beyond what was expected in the project brief.
what was the main thing that contributed to the high rankings sustainability-wise?
One of the key elements of that was the high-performance facade system, because that facade system with that integrated shading pretty much means that the double glazed unit, the insulating layer, never sees the sunlight. It's in constant shade, which means that it's an extraordinarily high performance envelope.
With all these unusual aspects of this building, or atypical, let's say, did you have to convince the client that this was all worth it? I mean, to tell them, okay, we're going to have this local material, we're going to tell this story. Did they ever say, oh, why don't you just give me a big glass box?
Well, one of the interesting things about tall buildings in a commercial environment is everyone's under a lot of pressure. You know, we've got to deliver these things under extraordinary pressure, meet a timeline. There's enormous amounts of money at stake. So what we need to do is we need to build a sense of trust and camaraderie. And to do that, we've got to make sure there are options and alternatives. So, for example, to achieve this really innovative facade system, we had to go through an enormous amount of sophisticated accelerated weather testing and performance testing, and no one could be quite sure how that was going to turn out. Meanwhile, we were building the building.
Right.
So we had another facade system entirely documented as a plan B. And I think it's one thing to engage people and spark their imagination and their ambition, but the reality is we've got to accept the risks that we've got to address, and we've got to fight them together. So that's, I think, how you build that sense of camaraderie and achieve true innovation and bring people along, is to know that actually, if this doesn't work out, there's a plan B. It's all going to be okay.